The 63-year-old woman collapsed in the middle of the dance floor, right in the middle of her daughter's first dance. The music died. 400 guests in expensive formal wear rose to their feet at once, and someone shouted that she had only fainted, that everyone should step back and give her air. But in the corner of the room, behind a cart stacked with dirty glasses, the hired maid working a day shift was the only person there who understood that this was not a fainting spell, and that the woman on the floor had very little time left. None of them knew that the woman they had just brushed aside like a shadow had once been the finest clinical pharmacist at St. Aubin Hospital, before another man's signature stripped away everything she had. And the man kneeling beside his mother, Raphael Belandi, 32, the boss who ruled all of Chicago's West Side, a man who had never begged anyone for anything in his life, was now only a helpless son, understanding for the first time that his money and his power meant nothing at all. When the bodyguard stepped in front of her and laid a hand on the gun beneath his suit jacket, Camille Prescott did not back away. She knelt down on the floor, her hands, roughened by cleaning chemicals, suddenly steady as stone, and in a voice that cut through the chaos like a blade, she said one sentence that silenced the entire room. Then she opened the pill case in the woman's purse, lifted out a single white tablet, and when she read the small marking stamped across its face, the blood went cold in her veins, because she had seen it once before, 3 years earlier, in the very file that had destroyed her life. If the story of this woman the world chose to forget has touched your heart, please leave a like so we know you're still listening. Share this video with someone who believes, as we do, that a person's worth is never measured by the clothes they happen to be wearing. And don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss the stories we bring you each week. Stories where one person willing to truly see us is enough to change an entire fate. 3 hours before the music went silent, Camille Prescott stood at the back entrance to the kitchen of the Belandi family mansion, rereading the message on a phone whose screen was split by a long crack running from one corner to the other. $400. Cash, paid at the end of the day. She had read those words no fewer than 10 times over the past 2 days, and every time she read them again, she saw in her mind the small plastic box sitting on top of the refrigerator at home, the box that held Micah's sound processor, the device that had stopped working the previous Tuesday afternoon. She had been quoted $385 for a replacement, plus the cost of having his hearing tested again. She had asked whether she could pay in installments, and the woman on the other end of the line had said, in a very kind voice, that she was terribly sorry. But rules were rules. Camille hadn't been angry. She had simply hung up, sat down on the edge of the bed, and started looking for work. She couldn't take a formal job because the civil judgment from 3 years earlier still hung over her head like a hook, and any wages carrying her name on a payroll would be garnished before the money ever reached her hands. So she survived on day labor, off-the-books jobs with no contracts and no names attached, jobs that paid in envelopes at 11 o'clock at night by the back door. The event manager met her in the service hallway, handed her an apron, and quickly told her everything she needed to know. Don't look the guests in the face. Don't speak to anyone. If somebody asks you something, just nod and keep moving. He looked her over from head to toe, then added the final instruction in the worn-out voice of a man who had said it too many times before. Tonight, her job was to make sure no one noticed she was in the room. Camille nodded. She had been used to not existing for a long time. The next 4 hours passed in a rhythm her body knew so well that she didn't have to think about it. Collect the dirty glasses, stack them on the cart, wheel them back to the kitchen, return to the room, refill water, wipe spilled wine from the floor before anyone had a chance to step in it, then collect more dirty glasses. She moved along the walls, kept her distance from every table, and in those 4 hours not a single guest looked directly into her face. At one point, as she tilted a water pitcher over the glass at the end of the head table, a broad-shouldered man standing behind her reached out and moved her aside. He wasn't forceful. He wasn't cruel. He simply shifted her out of his way the way someone might move a chair that had been left in the wrong place. The towel draped over her arm fell to the floor. Camille bent down, picked it up, folded it neatly, placed it back over her arm, and kept walking. She didn't raise her head, and she saw no reason to. 3 years earlier, people had taught her very clearly that there were rooms where her voice carried no weight, and she had learned that lesson at a price she would never finish paying. Sometime close to 9 o'clock, she stood in a corner of the room behind a cart that was nearly full and counted silently in her head. 2 more hours. 2 more hours, and she would have the envelope in her hand. 2 more hours, and she would catch the last bus home. And tomorrow morning she would call the audiology office the moment they opened. She thought of Micah's face lighting up when she placed the new processor in his hand, thought of the way he would lift both hands and sign thank you twice as fast as usual whenever he was happy. And for one very brief moment, surrounded by the smell of cooling food and the delicate clink of glasses, Camille Prescott smiled to herself. Then the conversation in the room began to fade. The master of ceremonies spoke into the microphone and announced that it was time for the bride to invite her mother onto the dance floor. Applause rose through the room, chairs scraped backward, and the first notes of the opening dance began to play. She didn't faint. Her heart is in an abnormal rhythm. The words came out of Camille's mouth with such cold certainty that the room, which only moments earlier had been filled with pounding footsteps and people calling to one another, seemed to freeze for a single instant. Hollis Ward, the broad-shouldered man who had moved her aside less than 3 hours earlier, stepped between her and the woman lying on the floor, one hand already resting on the holster beneath his suit jacket, and his eyes traveled from Camille's face to the water-stained apron she was still wearing and then back up again, as though he couldn't believe that someone so insignificant would dare open her mouth among people the entire city knew better than to cross. "Step back," Hollis said. Camille didn't move. She looked straight at him and said that if he blocked her way for another 30 seconds, this woman wouldn't get back up again. And she didn't say it loudly, didn't say it with a tremor in her voice, simply stated it the way someone might read a sentence already printed on a page. Raphael Belandi, kneeling beside his mother, lifted his head. He looked at Camille quickly, for less than the length of a breath. Then he spoke, and his voice was so quiet that the people standing farther out had to tilt their heads to hear him. "Take your hand away. Let her work." There was something in that quiet voice that made Hollis Ward remove his hand from the holster and step back immediately, and the 4 men standing in a curved line behind him moved with him, opening a clear space on the wooden floor. Camille didn't waste another second on any of them. She dropped to her knees, both knees touching the floor, and in that moment the hands that had been carrying trays and clearing glasses for 4 straight hours, hands roughened by cleaning chemicals and split at the fingertips, suddenly became steady in a way she herself didn't have time to notice. 3 years of silence inside her woke all at once. She placed 2 fingers into the hollow of the woman's neck, just beneath the angle of the jaw, searching for the carotid pulse, and she counted, irregular. Sometimes 3 rapid beats came one after another, followed by a pause so long it made the person counting feel as though her own heart had missed something too. Camille gently lifted one eyelid. The pupil responded slowly to the light, but it still responded. She bent down, brought her ear close to the woman's mouth, listened for 3 seconds, and felt shallow, shortened breaths against her skin, far too shallow for what they should have been. She placed her palm against the woman's chest and felt it rise and fall in quick, uneven movements. And at that exact moment, something in Camille's mind that had been asleep for 3 years began moving again, step by step, in the sequence it had once been trained to follow. Then Camille raised her head and began giving orders. "Call 911 right now. Tell them this is a cardiac arrhythmia in a 63-year-old woman. Conscious but unresponsive. Pulse irregular. Breathing shallow. Tell them they need to bring a defibrillator when they come. Don't let them ask you anything else. Just tell them exactly what I just told you." A man near the door pulled out his phone, his hand shaking so badly that he had to press twice before he hit the right number. "I need a completely clear path from here to the front entrance. Push the tables and chairs against the walls. Move those flower arrangements out of the way, and send one person outside to wait for them so they can be brought straight in here. Don't let them lose even 1 second trying to find the room." No one asked who she was. 4 men, then 6, then nearly a dozen men in expensive formal wear rushed to do exactly what she had said, dragging tables, shifting chairs, and in the middle of that urgency, there was something almost impossible to believe in the sight of an entire room full of men who were accustomed to giving orders, suddenly moving in careful coordination under the direction of a maid, wearing an apron. "One more thing," Camille said, her eyes never leaving the woman's face. "Did she bring a purse with her? A clutch, something small. Bring it to me right now." The bride, who was still kneeling on the other side of her mother with both hands around the woman's shoulders, looked up and said in a broken voice that yes, her mother had left it on the head table, and she immediately got to her feet and ran to retrieve it. Raphael Belandi remained exactly where he was, one hand wrapped around his mother's hand, and he stared at the woman kneeling across from him with a look he had never given anyone in his entire life. The room of 400 people had gone completely silent. It wasn't the silence of fear, and it wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of people who had just witnessed something they couldn't find any way to fit inside what they thought they understood. The purse was placed in Camille's hands less than 20 seconds later, and she pulled the zipper open in one decisive motion, slipped her hand inside, brushed past the wallet, the handkerchief, the reading glasses, until her fingers touched the thing she knew had to be there. A hard plastic pill organizer divided into 7 compartments for the 7 days of the week. She pulled it out, and before opening the lid, before touching anything inside, she did something she herself didn't understand, because her hands seemed to move on their own. She took the phone with the cracked screen from the pocket of her apron, raised it, and photographed the pill organizer while it was still untouched. Then she opened each compartment and took another photograph. It was the reflex of someone who had once stood in rooms where everything touched had to be documented, a reflex she had believed had died along with her license 3 years earlier, and yet it had remained there, intact, waiting for exactly this moment to wake again. "What medications does she take?" Camille asked without looking up. Raphael said he couldn't remember all of them, that the family's private physician prescribed them and his mother managed them herself. But the bride, still kneeling on the other side, immediately stumbled out 3 names, the kind of names a daughter remembered only because she had stood at the pharmacy counter many times picking them up for her mother. Camille nodded. Those 3 matched what she was seeing in the compartments, and her eyes moved over each tablet with the speed of someone who had done this tens of thousands of times. Then she stopped. In the 3rd compartment, among the familiar pills, there was a white tablet, round, the same diameter, the same beveled edge, a pill that, if placed beside the correct one, even the woman who swallowed it every morning wouldn't have been able to tell the difference. Camille lifted it between the tips of 2 fingers, turned the face of the tablet upward, and tilted it toward the light so she could read the tiny imprinted code pressed into its surface. That code didn't belong to the medication the woman had been prescribed. It belonged to something else. And that something else, when taken together with 2 of the other medications in the box, would produce exactly what was happening on this floor. Light from the chandelier above struck the tablet with a white, cold, razor-sharp gleam, and that lifeless light did what no command in the room could have done. It pulled Camille out of the present and threw her back into a place she had spent 3 years trying to bury. Because it was the same kind of light that came from the fluorescent fixtures in the basement pharmacy department of St. Aubin Hospital, the place that had once been her entire sky, where she had spent thousands of hours in a white lab coat checking every prescription, every dosage, every interaction, catching mistakes no one upstairs ever knew had been caught. They had called her the youngest and most meticulous clinical pharmacist in the department. She had loved that work the way people love something sacred, had believed she had been born to stand in exactly that place, between a human being and a mistake that could kill them. And then, one night, a patient died because of a fatal drug interaction. Camille had dispensed exactly what had been ordered, and she knew that with everything, she could still have recited every line in the system from that night without looking at it. But when the questions began, no one went looking for the person who had signed the order. They went looking for the easiest person in the room to replace, the one who had no money for a lawyer, no relatives on the board, no one standing behind her. The hearing lasted 9 minutes. 9 minutes to take away the thing she had traded her entire youth to earn. And the cruelest part, the thing that still rested inside her chest like a shard of glass, was that even now, she had never been told who the person who died that night actually was, because the patient's identity had been sealed at the family's request, and she had been told she had no right to know. She had been destroyed by a death she wasn't even allowed to name. 3 months later, her family lost their health insurance. And 8 months after that, her husband, Elliot, who had quietly stopped taking his own heart medication so the money could be saved for their son without saying a word to her, collapsed beside the dinner table on a Thursday evening. All of it returned to Camille in the space of a single heartbeat. Then the rasping breath of the woman on the floor cut through the memory like a blade and dragged her back into this room, with the white tablet resting in her palm and a human life counting down by the second. Camille closed her hand around the pill, raised her head, and said its name aloud, followed by a question that drained the color from Raphael Belandi's face. "Who put this pill in her medication box?" Camille asked, and her voice no longer sounded like the voice of someone asking permission to do her job. It was the voice of someone who knew with absolute certainty that she was holding something no one else in that room had seen. No one answered. She didn't wait. She repeated aloud the 3 medication names the bride had just given her, then named the one resting in her palm, and she explained that the first 3 were safe when taken together. But when this 4th drug was introduced among them, it prolonged the heart's conduction interval, and in a 63-year-old woman with pre-existing heart disease, after physical exertion on the dance floor, it could push the heart into a type of arrhythmia that the body might not be able to correct on its own. She spoke the medical term in the calm, measured voice of someone reading a sentence from a textbook, and it was that calmness that left all 400 people in the room utterly still, because not one of them understood even half of what she had just said. But every one of them understood that this woman knew exactly what she was talking about. Raphael Belandi's head snapped up. He asked what that meant, and Camille told him it meant his mother hadn't simply fallen ill without warning. It meant something that shouldn't have been inside. Her body was there, and now the only thing they could do was keep her breathing until the ambulance arrived. Then she handed the pill to the bride and told her to hold on to it tightly, not to put it back in the organizer, not to let it leave her hand. And Camille turned back to the woman lying on the floor. She slipped one hand beneath the woman's neck, placed the other against her forehead, and tilted her head back, just enough to open the airway as fully as possible. Then Camille leaned down, lowered her ear close to the woman's mouth, and listened. She was still breathing, shallowly and irregularly, but she was still breathing. Camille loosened the collar around her neck, removed the brooch, pinning the fabric tightly across her chest, and began counting, not aloud, only in her head, her eyes flicking toward the clock above the door to mark the time exactly as she had done thousands of times before. Mrs. Belandi, my name is Camille. You're in the ballroom. Your son and daughter are right here with you. The ambulance is coming. All you need to do is breathe with me. You don't have to do anything else. She spoke those words close to the woman's ear in a steady voice, and didn't stop. Even though she couldn't be certain the woman could hear her, because she knew that sometimes the last thing remaining to a person who was slipping away was the sound of someone's voice calling them back. The bride knelt on the other side, holding her mother's hand against her cheek with both of her own, crying without sound, her shoulders trembling in waves. Her white wedding gown spread across the wooden floor. Raphael said nothing. He only held tightly to his mother's ankle, one hand gripping it as though the moment he let go she would drift away, and his eyes remained fixed on Camille's face, following every smallest movement she made like a man reading the weather across the surface of the sea. Then it happened. Very slowly, almost too subtly to notice unless someone was watching closely. The woman's chest rose a little more deeply, then rose that way again. The bluish color around her lips began to fade. Her eyelids fluttered and opened slightly, her unfocused pupils wandering for a moment before settling on the face bent very close above her. Her lips moved without sound, forming only the shape of some word. The entire room broke apart into one enormous breath of relief. Someone said, "Thank God." The bride began sobbing aloud and collapsed against her mother's shoulder. Several of the men standing around the outer edge let their shoulders fall, and Hollis Ward lifted a hand and wiped his face. Only one person in that room didn't breathe a sigh of relief. Camille didn't take her eyes off the woman's face for even a second. She reached out, placed 2 fingers against the woman's wrist, searched for the pulse, and kept them there. Because during those 3 years in the basement at Aubin, she had learned that the most dangerous moment wasn't when everything was at its worst. It was the moment when everything appeared to be getting better. She lifted her head, looked around the room once, and told everyone standing there that no one was to move her, no one was to give her anything to drink, and no one was to leave their position. Not a single person argued. The room fell silent again, but this time it was an entirely different kind of silence. They were quiet because they were waiting for her next command. Camille felt it before she saw it. Beneath the 2 fingertips resting against the woman's wrist, the pulse that had already been weak suddenly slowed, then missed a beat, then slowed again, like a machine running through the last of its fuel. She looked up at the woman's face. The eyelids that had opened only moments before were closed again. The chest that had managed a few deeper rises now made only the smallest movement, then one smaller still, and then nothing at all. She stopped breathing. Camille said it without allowing the words to fall into silence, because she didn't have time for silence. She swept her apron aside, turned, rose upright on both knees beside the woman's hip, placed the heel of one hand in the center of her chest, exactly on the point she had learned to find when she was a 21-year-old student, placed her other hand over it, interlocked her fingers, locked both elbows straight, and began compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted aloud. She counted aloud because rhythm was the only thing that could keep this entire room from collapsing, and because she needed to hear the sound of her own voice. Beneath her palms, the woman's chest sank and sprang back with each compression, and every time it sank, blood was being pushed through her body in place of the heart that had stopped doing its work. The bride screamed for her mother. Someone farther out in the room began to cry. Camille heard none of it. Her entire world had narrowed to the exact distance between her two hands and a silent heart. Sweat ran down her temple and disappeared beneath the collar of her uniform. Her arms began to tire by the second minute, the muscles in her shoulders tightening and then burning. But the rhythm of her counting didn't speed up or slow down by even a fraction of a second, because this was what they had trained into her through all those years, that when everyone else was falling apart, her job was to become the one thing that could still hold the rhythm. And inside Camille's mind, between the numbers, a thought passed quickly and vanished. 3 years earlier, in a room where she had been given only 9 minutes, people had stood up and called these hands careless. They had written that word on a piece of paper, stamped it, and taken everything she had. Those same hands were now the only thing keeping a heart in this world. 30. Camille stopped the compressions, slipped one hand beneath the woman's chin, tilted her head back, lowered her ear, and listened for exactly 3 seconds. Nothing. She gave 2 breaths, watched the woman's chest rise, then immediately returned her hands to position and began another cycle. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was then that Raphael Belandi did something no man in that room had ever imagined he would see in his lifetime. He let go of his mother's ankle, leaned forward, and closed his hand around Camille's wrist. Not squeezing, not pulling, simply holding on the way a drowning man clings to the side of a boat. She looked up at him for exactly 1 beat without stopping her hands. The face the entire city of Chicago knew never changed. The face of a man who had given orders others dared repeat only in whispers, had completely broken apart, and there was nothing left in his eyes, except the naked terror of a son watching his mother slip away. Please. Raphael said it so softly that only Camille heard him, and it was a word Raphael Belandi had never spoken to anyone in all 32 years of his life. Then don't let go of her hand, Camille answered, her eyes already back on the chest beneath her palms. Talk to her. Call her. She can still hear you. And Raphael, the man who ruled the entire West Side, knelt close beside his mother, bent his head near her ear, and began calling her by the name he had used since he was a child, over and over, his voice growing rougher each time. Camille counted through the 5th cycle, then the 6th. Her arms had gone numb, her knees ached against the hard wooden floor, and she knew better than anyone in that room that time was running out, that every second passing was another door closing. And then, from somewhere beyond the walls of the building, cutting through the crying and the counting, a sound reached them. At first it was only a thin thread in the distance, so faint it might have been imagined. Then it became clearer, clearer still, closer, the siren of an ambulance racing toward them. Camille didn't look up. She didn't stop her hands. Through clenched teeth, she said only one thing: open the door. Right now, the great doors flew open, and 2 paramedics rushed in, pushing a stretcher and an equipment case along the clear path the men in formal wear had already opened for them. The one in front was a young man of about 27, and when he dropped to his knees on the other side of the woman and looked up at the person performing chest compressions, his entire face went still. Miss Prescott. The words broke out of him in disbelief. Camille Prescott. Is that really you? Camille didn't stop. She looked at him for exactly 1 beat. And in that brief instant, beneath all the pressure bearing down around her, she recognized the face. He had once been a timid student intern who followed her through night shifts in the basement of St. Aubin years earlier. The boy she had patiently taught how to read a prescription, how to check an interaction, how to stay calm when everything around him was coming apart. Now that boy was a trained paramedic kneeling in front of her. Ezra. She said his name very softly. Then she forced down everything that had just risen into her chest, and she gave the handoff. Female patient, 63 years old, history of heart disease, currently taking 3 cardiac medications, collapsed during exertion approximately 11 minutes ago. Initially conscious, pulse irregular, respirations shallow, regained consciousness for several seconds, then stopped breathing. I began chest compressions approximately 4 minutes ago, 6 cycles, with rescue breaths, no defibrillation yet. Suspected arrhythmia caused by a drug interaction, and I found 1 tablet in her pill organizer that doesn't belong to her prescription. The imprint code doesn't match. That tablet is currently in her daughter's hand. No one has touched it except me. She delivered the information in one continuous flow, every word falling exactly where it belonged, nothing unnecessary, nothing missing. And while she spoke, Ezra opened the equipment case. His partner placed the electrode pads across the woman's chest. The monitor came alive with a waveform running across the screen, and the entire emergency team fell into rhythm with Camille immediately, like musicians who had rehearsed together for years. Ezra repeated each detail as he worked to confirm it, and when he looked up one final time before delivering the shock, he said something very quietly, almost only for her to hear. Still the cleanest handoff I've ever heard in my life. He said it with the sincere respect of a former student, and because of that, the words went deeper into Camille's chest than any insult she had swallowed over the past 3 years. She didn't answer. She moved back and settled onto her heels, both arms trembling from exhaustion, and watched the line on the monitor jump, then settle into a weak but regular rhythm. The woman's heart was beating again. Ezra looked up and announced that they had a pulse, and the entire room erupted. Camille waited while they lifted the woman onto the stretcher, secured the straps, and connected the oxygen. Then she stood, walked over to the bride, who was still trembling, held out her hand, and took back the white tablet. She gave it to Ezra, along with the pill organizer, and she spoke in the voice of someone who knew exactly what she was asking for. Listen to me. This has to be sealed here, right now, documented on the intake record as the patient's property, with your signature and a family member's signature. Don't put it in your pocket. Don't hand it to anyone else. When you get to the hospital, request a toxicology screen and preserve the entire chain of custody. You understand what I'm telling you. Ezra looked at her for 1 second, then nodded, and he did exactly as she said. He labeled it, recorded the time, handed the bride a pen to sign. All of it done right there on the floor between the chairs that had been pushed against the walls. Then they wheeled the stretcher away. Ezra looked back at Camille one last time, his eyes full of questions he didn't have time to ask, and then he disappeared through the doors. The room immediately fell into a strange silence after the storm. Camille bent down, picked up her apron, brushed off her knees, and realized that her hands were trembling again, just as they had before. She looked up and found Raphael Belandi staring at her. He said nothing. He simply stood there among the displaced tables and chairs, his gaze fixed on her as though she were a question he had no choice but to answer. Camille turned away. She had become far too accustomed to being invisible, and she didn't want to be seen. She walked straight to the back door, took off the apron, and handed it to the manager, accepted the envelope, and left the building before anyone had the chance to ask her name. The last bus dropped Camille off 3 blocks from home, and she walked the rest of the way on legs she could barely feel, one hand clenched around the envelope inside her coat pocket, as though she were afraid it might somehow dissolve before she reached the door. She climbed 3 flights of stairs, slipped the key into the lock, and when the door opened, the warmth of the apartment rushed against her face and drove away the cold of the long night all at once. Winnie Marsh, the 70-year-old neighbor who usually came over to watch Micah whenever Camille worked a night shift, was sitting in the old armchair with a book resting on her lap. She looked up with a smile and said softly that he had been such a good boy, that he had finished his whole bowl of soup, brushed his teeth by himself, and been asleep since 9 o'clock. But before going to bed, he had insisted on finishing a picture he wanted to save for his mother. Camille thanked her with every bit of genuine gratitude she had, pressed several bills into her hand even though Winnie always tried to wave them away, then walked her to the door. When the door closed and Camille was alone in the apartment, she stood motionless in the middle of the cramped living room for a long time. She didn't take off her coat. She didn't turn on the light. She simply stood there. Then she moved quietly into the small room where her son was sleeping. Micah lay curled beneath a thin blanket, one hand resting loosely beside his cheek, his hair spread across the pillow, his face so peaceful that Camille's chest tightened with a kind of love tangled together with a pain she had never been able to name. On the little table beside the bed was the picture Winnie had mentioned. Camille picked it up and tilted it toward the light coming through the window. The boy had drawn 2 hands, nothing but 2 hands, drawn enormous across almost the entire sheet of paper, the fingers arranged in exactly the position he used every morning when he opened his eyes and called for her. Beneath them, in the uneven handwriting of a 6-year-old child, he had written a single word: Mom. Camille sat down on the edge of the bed, placed the picture on her lap, and only then did everything inside her finally collapse. She looked at her own 2 hands in the darkness. They were shaking violently, impossible to hold still. The very same hands that only 2 hours earlier had been steady as stone against the chest of a stranger. She thought about the money in the envelope, about tomorrow morning when she would call the audiology office the moment they opened, about the moment Micah would hear her voice calling his name again. And then she thought about Ezra Vance's face, about the words he had spoken with such complete sincerity, words that had driven straight into the center of her chest and were still lodged there. Camille pulled the phone with the cracked screen from her coat pocket. She meant to turn off the alarm, or check the time. She wasn't even sure what she had intended to do. but her finger slid instead to the photo library. And there they were, the last 2 pictures she had taken that night. The 7-compartment pill organizer. She opened the second image, enlarged it, shifted the frame toward the 3rd compartment, and narrowed her eyes at the tiny imprinted code pressed into the surface of the white tablet. She had already read it once, right there in the ballroom, in less than 2 seconds, in the middle of chaos, and she had known with certainty that it didn't belong to the woman's prescription. But now, in the stillness of this room, with no one dying in front of her, and her mind finally moving more slowly, she looked at that code again, and a freezing sensation crawled down her spine, because she had seen that sequence of characters before, not in a textbook, not during some long-forgotten shift. She had seen it on a black and white printout, in the stack of documents placed in front of her 3 years earlier at the hearing that lasted 9 minutes, when they had read aloud the list of substances found in a man's body on the night he died, and told her that she was the one who had given them to him. Camille had sat there with both hands resting on the table, and said over and over that she hadn't dispensed that medication, that it wasn't on the prescription, that she wanted the system logs reviewed. No one listened. 9 minutes later, it was over. 3 years had passed, and the name of the man who died that night was still sealed, still an empty space she wasn't allowed to touch. Camille sat perfectly still on the edge of her son's bed, the phone glowing in the darkness, and realistically stood that the same thing that had killed a man 3 years earlier had nearly killed Raphael Belandi's mother tonight. Raphael Belandi stood in the 3rd-floor hospital corridor all that night without sitting down once, and close to 4 o'clock in the morning, the physician on duty stepped out, lowered his mask, and told him that his mother was out of immediate danger. Then the doctor added one more sentence, one Raphael would hear over and over in his head for weeks afterward, that if the chest compressions had begun roughly 10 minutes later, or if no one had recognized that the problem was coming from her medication, they would have been telling him something entirely different tonight. Raphael thanked him, stood there a little longer looking through the glass into the room where his mother lay, with wires running from her body to the monitor, then walked outside, got into the car, and made a single phone call. He needed to know who that woman was. In the world Raphael had lived in all his life, there were people whose entire profession was digging up things other people had tried to bury, and one phone call was all it took for that silent machinery to begin moving. 2 days later, a thick file was placed on the wooden desk in his study. Raphael sat beneath the light of the desk lamp and began turning the pages. He turned them very slowly. He read every page, and for 40 minutes he never once reached for the glass of whiskey that had already been poured beside him. There were moments when he stopped for a long time on a particular page before continuing. Once, he pushed his chair back, stood, walked to the window, remained there staring into the darkness outside for perhaps half a minute, then returned to the desk and kept reading. The man waiting nearby to give him the rest of the report began to feel uneasy, because he had worked for the Belandi family for 11 years, and he knew that when Raphael went silent, that was when he was most dangerous. Then Raphael reached the final page. There was a copy of the hearing transcript, and in the lower right corner, beneath the notes referring to related records, there was a small line referencing the case number of the patient who had died, followed by a name that should never have appeared on any piece of paper. Salvatore Belandi. Raphael didn't move. He said nothing for 4 full minutes. The man standing by the door later said those were the longest 4 minutes of his 11 years working for the family. That he stood there watching his employer sit completely still, with one hand resting on the page, and he didn't dare breathe too loudly. Because in Raphael Belandi's mind, the entire room had just collapsed. The woman who had knelt on the floor of his home, who had pressed her hands, roughened by cleaning chemicals, against his mother's chest, who had pulled her back from death without asking for a single cent, was the same woman his entire family had cursed for 3 years. She was the name Ambrose Del Vecchio had spoken in Raphael's dining room during that week of mourning. She was the person they had told him had killed his father through negligence, and Raphael remembered exactly what he had done when he heard that name. He remembered sitting in this very chair, still wearing a black mourning band on his arm, and saying only one sentence, that he wanted that person never to touch another human being's medication again for as long as she lived. He hadn't asked a single question. He hadn't requested the records. He hadn't demanded to meet her. He had simply given an order, and the Belandi family's connections had reached exactly where they needed to reach. The necessary phone calls had been made to exactly the people who needed to receive them, and the board sitting in that hearing room had understood perfectly well that the Belandi family wanted someone held responsible, and they had given Raphael exactly that in 9 minutes. Raphael sat there with one hand resting on the page, and for the first time in his life he understood that he hadn't come after the tragedy that destroyed that woman. He was the tragedy. He had taken her license, taken her career, taken her good name, driven her down to the bottom of this city, and he had done all of it without ever seeing her face even once. Then, 3 years later, the very hands he had destroyed were the hands that kept his mother in this world. Raphael rose very slowly. He asked the man by the door only one question, who had been the first person 3 years earlier to give him the name Camille Prescott. The man hesitated, then answered that it had been Mr. Del Vecchio. Raphael gave a single nod. He said nothing more, but when he turned his face toward the window, the look in his eyes was completely different. 9 days after that night, late one afternoon before the diner had filled with customers, Camille was standing at the sink behind the kitchen with both hands submerged in soapy water when the manager leaned his... Camille dried her hands on her apron and stepped out, and she stopped dead in the narrow aisle between 2 rows of tables. The woman standing there, resting lightly against the back of a chair, wearing a dark coat, her face still pale but her eyes completely alert, was the same woman Camille had last seen lying motionless on a stretcher. Antonia Belandi stepped toward her. Camille opened her mouth to say that she didn't need to come all this way, that Camille had only done what anyone who knew how would have done. It was the answer she had prepared for days, because she had known that sooner or later someone would come to thank her. But Antonia didn't give her the chance. She reached out with both hands, took Camille's hands in hers, and did something very strange. She turned Camille's palms upward and looked down at the calluses, the fingertips cracked from chemicals, the red marks that hadn't yet had time to heal. She looked for a long while, then she raised her eyes. "I didn't come here to thank you," Antonia said. "Thank you is too small, and I don't have much time left for saying small things. I came because I have to tell you something I've carried for 3 years." Camille stood still, her hand still resting inside Antonia's. "You already know my name," Antonia said, "but I knew yours long before the night of my daughter's wedding. Camille Prescott. I first read that name in November 3 years ago, on a piece of paper someone handed to my family, and they told me that was the woman who had caused my husband's death." For a moment, Camille didn't understand. Then she did. She understood all of it at once, and she felt the floor beneath her feet tilt. For 3 years, the name of the man who had died that night had remained hidden behind a sealed line she had been told she had no right to know. For 3 years, she had lived with an empty space in the middle of her life, carrying a death she had been forced to bear without even being allowed to call it by name. And now that name was being spoken inside a diner, by the widow herself, by the very woman Camille had just knelt down and saved. "Salvatore Belandi," Antonia said. "My husband. He died at St. Aubin on the night of November 4th. Camille pulled her hands away. She stepped back half a pace, until the edge of a table pressed against her back, and she heard her own voice come out very softly, almost as if it belonged to someone else, saying that she hadn't done it, that she had dispensed exactly what was prescribed, that she had said those same words again and again 3 years ago, and no one had been willing to listen. Antonia nodded, and what she said next was something Camille hadn't prepared herself to hear. "I know," she said. "I never believed you did it. Not for a single day." Camille stared at her, unable to speak. "My husband took medication every day for 14 years, and the man who prescribed it was our family's private physician. I was the one who sat beside him every morning. I knew what he took and what he didn't take. So when they came to me and said that a pharmacist, who was 25 years old, had given my husband the wrong medication, I asked them one very simple question. Who signed the prescription? No one answered me." She paused, and her voice softened. "I told my son, during the week of the funeral. I sat in the dining room and told Raphael that something wasn't right, that he shouldn't rush to put the blame on anyone, that he needed to find out who had signed that prescription. But there was someone else in the room that day. Mr. Del Vecchio." He stood up, put his hand on my son's shoulder, and said exactly one thing. Antonia looked directly into Camille's eyes. He said someone had already been held responsible. Camille stood there, surrounded by the smell of grease and the clatter of dishes drifting from the kitchen, and she felt something inside her chest begin to break very slowly. Her entire life, everything she had lost, had been contained inside a sentence that lasted less than 3 seconds, spoken in a room she had never entered, by a man she had never met. "My son believed him," Antonia said. "He had just lost his father. He was 29 years old, and he needed a name to pour his anger into. Mr. Del Vecchio gave him yours." Then she stepped closer and took Camille's hand again. "I've been looking for you for 3 years. I called the hospital, and they told me you had left. I went looking for your old address, and they told me you had moved away. I kept thinking I was going to die before I had the chance to say this to you." She tightened her grip around Camille's hand. "And then you were the one who knelt down on my floor. You tell me, is there anyone in this world who could arrange something like that?" 3 nights later, when Camille stepped out through the back door of the diner at nearly 11 o'clock, she stopped in the middle of the narrow alley because a black car was parked tight against the curb, and the man leaning against its door was the same man she hadn't been able to get out of her mind for almost 2 weeks. Raphael Belandi didn't approach her. He only said that he wanted 10 minutes to speak with her, and that he would leave immediately if she told him to go. Camille stood beneath the single yellow light hanging on the brick wall, her arms folded across her chest like a shield, and said that she was tired and wanted to go home to her son. But she didn't walk away. Raphael didn't waste time. He told her plainly that he had had her investigated, that he knew who she had once been and knew what had happened to her, and that he knew the name Roland Whitmore, knew the man who had signed the prescription that night and then allowed someone else to carry the consequences. Camille's face went white, then flushed red, and through clenched teeth she asked what right he had to tear open her private life. Raphael didn't avoid the question. He said he had no right at all. Then he added that he also knew Whitmore had been his family's private physician for more than a decade, that the man still sat at their dinner table every Christmas, and that until the previous week, he had still been the person prescribing medication for Raphael's mother. "That man destroyed you," Raphael said, and his voice dropped very low, carrying the cold kind of power that belonged to the world he came from. "He took your license, took your work, pushed you down here. 3 years, and he has lived comfortably ever since, sleeping well every night, his name still carved into the wall of a building. I have ways to make that end, ways the law in this city will never reach. I can make him lose everything he has, his career, his reputation, even his peace. You don't have to do anything, you only have to nod once." The offer hung between them in the alley like a loaded weapon. Raphael stood there waiting, almost certain that a woman who had endured so much injustice would seize the chance he had just placed in her hands. But Camille didn't nod. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he began to feel uneasy, and then she shook her head. And when she spoke, there wasn't a trace of bitterness in her voice, only a cold, quiet certainty that made every word fall with weight. "No," she said, "I don't want that, and I never will." Raphael frowned, unable to believe what he was hearing, and he asked why, after everything that man had taken from her, after 3 years of living at the bottom because of his guilt, she could possibly refuse. Camille stepped 1 pace closer, and there was something in her eyes then that Raphael had never seen in anyone from his world. "Because I spent my entire youth standing between a human being and a mistake that could kill them," she said. "That was my job. Every day, check, verify, stop it before it happened. I did it for people I had never met, people who would never know my name. I knelt beside your mother not because she was rich or powerful, but because she was a human being. If I let you go and cause pain to another person in my name now, then I become the very thing that destroyed me. Someone who believes they have enough power to decide another person's fate without anyone's permission." Raphael stood still. "I don't need blood, Mr. Belandi," Camille continued, and this time her voice trembled, but not from weakness. "If you make him lose everything in 1 night, tomorrow I'll still be a maid washing dishes. My record will still say I was negligent. My license still won't come back. And people will still say some powerful man stepped in to help me, instead of saying that I was innocent. I don't want pity. I want the truth. I want it written down in black and white, stamped, signed, and dated, so that 20 years from now, when my son is grown, if he searches his mother's name, what he reads will be the truth and not a rumor." She stepped back, and the final words she spoke were very quiet. "A person's dignity isn't measured by how much pain they can inflict on the one who hurt them. It's measured by whether they can remain themselves when the whole world has given them every reason to let go." Camille turned to leave, but Raphael called her name, not in the commanding voice he had used all his life, and not in that quiet voice that made other people step aside. He called her name like a man preparing to step into a place with no bottom. "There's one more thing," he said. "If I let you walk away without saying it, then everything I've told you tonight is a lie." Camille stopped, turned halfway back toward him, and waited. Above them, the first drops of rain began tapping against the metal lid of a trash bin at the far end of the alley. "You already know the man who died that night was my father," Raphael said. "My mother told you, but she didn't tell you the rest, because she doesn't know the rest." He straightened away from the car door. Both hands hung at his sides. 3 years ago, when they brought your name into my house, I was 29 years old. I had just buried my father. I was sitting in the dining room, the whole family waiting for me to say something. And someone put a piece of paper in front of me with the name Camille Prescott written on it. He stopped, and when he continued, each word came slowly, as though he had to pull it up from somewhere very deep inside himself. I didn't ask who signed the prescription. I didn't demand to see the records. I didn't ask how old you were, how long you had worked there, whether you had a family. I didn't ask a single question. I said only one thing, that I wanted that person never to touch another human being's medication again for as long as she lived. The rain began falling harder. Camille didn't move. Then the phone calls were made. Raphael said, "You understand what I mean. In this city, when the Belandi family wants something to happen, it happens, and no one has to put it in writing. The board sitting in that room understood perfectly well that they needed to give me someone, and they gave me you in 9 minutes." He lifted his eyes to hers. "Those 9 minutes weren't some accident of the system, Camille. They were me." Camille still said nothing. Rainwater ran down her temple, pressing strands of hair against her cheek, and she simply stood there, looking at him as though she were staring at something she couldn't fit anywhere inside her mind. "You asked me what right I had to tear through your life," Raphael said. "This is the answer. I didn't come after your tragedy to help you. I was the tragedy. I took your credentials away. I pushed you out of that hospital. 3 years of washing dishes. 3 years of taking day labor one shift at a time. 3 years of your son growing up in an apartment he never should have had to live in. All of it began with one sentence from an angry 29-year-old man who was too lazy to ask one more question." His voice grew rougher as he continued. "And 2 weeks ago, you knelt down on the floor of my house. You performed chest compressions on my mother with the same hands I told people to strip everything from. If you had stayed in the corner that night and never stepped forward, no one in this world could have blamed you for a single thing." Raphael stood beneath the rain as it grew heavier by the moment, and for the first time in his life, the man who ruled the entire West Side didn't know what to do with his own hands. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I know I don't have the right to ask for that. I only wanted you to hear the truth from my own mouth instead of reading it in some file. Because you've already spent 3 years living with a truth people hid from you, and I won't let you spend one more day living with another truth kept hidden." Camille looked at him for a long time. She opened her mouth once, then closed it again. Too many things rose into her throat at the same time. Anger, pain, the dizzying shock of finally seeing the full shape of the thing that had crushed her life, and something else she didn't want to name yet, but she said none of it. She pulled the collar of her coat higher around her neck, turned her back on him, and walked away. She went straight toward the mouth of the alley through the rain, not running, not looking back, without a single word, and Raphael Belandi remained there alone in the soaked alley, watching her disappear around the corner, understanding that he had just received exactly what he deserved. That night, Camille came home with her clothes soaked through, changed, and sat down on the edge of her son's bed in the dark. Micah was sleeping deeply, one arm draped across the worn stuffed bear beside him, and on the wall above his bed was the drawing of the 2 hands that she had taped there a few days earlier. Camille sat for a long time. She thought about what the man in the alley had told her, about those 9 minutes she had always believed were simply the cruelty of a cold, indifferent system, and which she now knew had a specific face standing behind them. She thought she should hate him. Part of her did hate him. But as she sat there in the darkness and allowed the anger to settle, she realized something that chilled her more deeply than the anger itself. If Raphael Belandi hadn't told her the truth that night, no one ever would have. He could have stayed silent. He could have given her money. He could have arranged a respectable job for her somewhere, and she would have lived the rest of her life, never knowing what had truly crushed her. He had placed in her hands the one weapon that could be turned back against him, and he had done it standing in the rain without asking her for anything in return. Camille reached out and smoothed the hair away from her son's forehead. She thought about the question she had asked herself for 3 years, why she had chosen that profession in the first place. A profession with no glory, no applause. A profession where, when you did your job at its very best, no one ever knew what you had done. And she remembered the answer. Because every time she caught an error before it reached someone, there was a person somewhere who went home and ate dinner with their family without ever knowing that night might have been their last. She had been that person. And in that ballroom full of strangers, when she knelt on the floor, she had become that person one more time. Then she thought about Micah. She thought about 20 years from now, when he would be grown, and she asked herself what kind of mother she wanted him to know. A woman who had been treated unjustly and bowed her head and accepted it because she was afraid. Or a woman who stood up and fought to reclaim her own name. She sat there until the first streaks of morning light appeared around the window frame, and by the time she stood, She had made her decision. She was going back. Not because of Raphael Belandi, not to help him atone for what he had done, and not to take revenge on anyone. She was going back because somewhere in this city there was a file bearing her name, and inside that file was a word she refused to let remain there for one more day. 3 days later, Camille walked into a lawyer's office on the 14th floor of a building on LaSalle Street. Renata Kowalski was a 47-year-old woman with a gaze so direct it was almost uncomfortable, and she had already finished reading the file Raphael had sent before Camille ever arrived. She didn't invite Camille to sit with polite formalities. She simply pushed the file across the desk toward her and asked one question: whether Camille was certain she wanted to reopen this matter, because once it was opened, it couldn't be closed again. Camille said she was certain. Renata nodded, then told her there was one thing she wanted made clear from the beginning. Mr. Belandi is the one paying me, and I know who he is, but I want you to understand that I don't work his way. I've won cases this entire city said couldn't be won, and I won them with documents, with dates, signatures, system logs, not fear. If you want someone frightened into silence, you've come to the wrong place. Camille looked at her and said that was exactly why she was sitting there. Then Renata told her the second truth. 3 years had passed. Many records had been sealed. Many people had moved away. And the name Roland Whitmore was still a wall built from money and connections woven through Chicago's medical and legal worlds. She told Camille there would come a point when everything seemed completely blocked, and when that happened, someone would advise her to stop. She asked whether Camille was ready for that. Camille was silent for a long time. Then she spoke, and her voice no longer carried the cold edge it had held in the alley that night. There was only a deep weariness left in it, so quiet that Renata had to lean forward to hear her clearly. 3 years ago, I ran away, she said. They took my license, and I left. I moved. I hid my past the way you hide a wound no one is allowed to see, and I told myself that was the smart thing to do. I was wrong. I wasn't running away from them. I was running away from myself. She lifted her eyes. I won't do that a second time, Mrs. Kowalski. Go ahead and begin. The first weeks passed slowly, blocked at every turn. Renata Kowalski filed a petition to reopen the disciplinary hearing and received a response stating that most of the records had been sealed at the request of the patient's family. She filed a second petition, this time attaching written consent from the widow herself, and they replied that some of the documents could no longer be located in the archives. A nurse who had been on duty the night of November 4th agreed to speak by phone, arranged to meet on Friday morning, then called back on Thursday night and said in a trembling voice that she had thought it over carefully and didn't want to be involved in any of this. She hung up before Renata could ask another question. Renata put down the phone and told Camille that someone had called the woman before she called them. Camille asked how she knew. Renata said because she had been doing this work for 22 years, and people didn't change their minds at 10 o'clock at night unless someone had called them. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Raphael Belandi was searching for the answer to a different question. He spent hours sitting in his father's study, a room where he hadn't touched a single thing in 3 years, opening every drawer, going through every stack of papers, every notebook. Then he found it inside an envelope at the bottom of the last drawer. It was a draft transfer document, fully prepared but never signed, dated near the end of October that year, only a few days before the night his father died. Every legitimate asset belonging to the Belandi family, the real estate, 2 transportation companies, a chain of warehouses, all of it was to be transferred into Antonia Belandi's name. Raphael read it 3 times, then carried it downstairs and placed it in front of his mother. Antonia stared at the paper for a long time before she spoke. She told him that during the final year of his life, her husband had changed. He had said he was tired, that he wanted his son to be spared the life he himself had lived, and he had begun preparing to separate everything legitimate from the rest of the family's affairs, placing it all under her name because she had never been involved in the family business, and then gradually cutting the ties from there. She said he had discussed the plan with only 2 people, with her and with Ambrose Del Vecchio. Then he died before he could put his signature on the page. Raphael asked his mother one question, whether she had mentioned any of this to anyone recently. Antonia nodded. She said that earlier that year, when her health had begun to worsen, she had decided to complete her husband's final wish. She had instructed the family attorney to prepare the entire document again, and she had spoken about it over dinner, right at her own dining table, in front of Ambrose. She said she intended to sign it the week after Noemi's wedding. Raphael remained silent for a long time after that. Inside his mind, the scattered pieces began sliding into their proper places. and the picture they formed sent a chill down his spine. 3 years earlier, his father had been preparing to sign a document that would push Ambrose Del Vecchio out of everything the man had spent 40 years building, and his father had died before he could sign it. Now Raphael's mother was preparing to sign that same document, and she had collapsed on the dance floor before she could put pen to paper. The same move, only with a different person sitting at the head of the table. Renata Kowalski received the hospital toxicology results the following day, along with the sealed evidence record for the pill organizer Ezra Vance had signed right there on the ballroom floor that night. She called Camille into the office and placed the results in front of her. Camille read them, and as she did, the color slowly drained from her face. She said the concentration in Antonia's blood couldn't have come from a single pill taken that evening. She said that for the level to be this high, the substance would have had to enter Antonia's body regularly, over a period of months, a little at a time, never enough to cause any obvious symptoms, only enough to make her already weakened heart grow a little weaker every day without anyone noticing. Renata asked why. Then, it had happened that particular night. Camille was silent for a moment, before answering that the human body endured things, until one day it couldn't endure them anymore. And that night, after months of accumulation, Antonia had stepped onto the dance floor and danced with her daughter. One song, that was all the exertion it took. No one chose that night, Camille said softly. They only waited until it happened on its own. And if I hadn't been standing in the corner of that room that night, no one in this world would ever have known that she wasn't supposed to die from heart disease. There was one name Camille had avoided speaking for 3 years, and now she had to go find it herself. Lonnie Pratt had been the pharmacy technician on duty with her on the night of November 4th, a quiet 45-year-old man who used to bring her coffee at 3 o'clock in the morning, the man who had sat in the waiting room throughout her hearing that day and was never called inside. He was now working at a retail pharmacy 4 miles from St. Aubin, and when Camille walked in, he recognized her immediately and just as quickly lowered his eyes. She didn't ask how he had been. She only said she wanted to buy him a cup of coffee and needed 10 minutes of his time. They sat in a small cafe across the street. Lonnie stirred his coffee for a long time without drinking it. Then he spoke first, saying that he knew why she had come and that he was sorry. Camille said nothing. He told her that back then he had already written a statement, printed it out, folded it, slipped it into his coat pocket, and carried it to the hospital on the morning of the hearing. Then someone had called him into a room and spoken with him for about 15 minutes. They mentioned that his wife was undergoing treatment at the time and that his entire family depended on his health insurance. They mentioned that he still had 19 years left on his mortgage. No one threatened him. They simply said those things, very calmly, and then left him sitting there to think about them. He said he had spent 3 hours in the waiting room with that piece of paper in his pocket, and when they called the next person's name, it wasn't his, so he stood up and went home. He said that for 3 years there hadn't been a single morning when he looked into the mirror without thinking about what he had done. Camille let him finish. Then she opened her bag, took out a photograph, and placed it on the table between them. It showed a middle-aged man at a family gathering, smiling with one arm around his wife. She told Lonnie that this was the man who had died that night, that his name was Salvatore Belandi, and that she herself had only learned that name a few weeks earlier, after 3 years of being forbidden to know it. Lonnie looked at the photograph and couldn't say a word. "I didn't come here to pressure you," Camille said. "I'm not threatening you. I have nothing to threaten you with, and I don't blame you either. Your wife was sick and you were afraid. I understand that better than anyone, because I have a child too, and I've been afraid for 3 years. She pushed the photograph a little closer to him. "I only came here to tell you one thing. You've been silent for 3 years. I've paid the price for 3 years. One of us has to stop first, or this will keep going until both of us are dead, and I can't keep stopping anymore." Lonnie Pratt sat motionless for a long time. Then he raised a hand and wiped his face, and he said he still had the statement, that it had been sitting in the drawer of his bedside table for 3 years, and that he had never thrown it away. 3 days later, he sat in Renata Kowalski's office and signed a sworn affidavit. That same week, Ezra Vance came in as well. He brought a copy of the intake record from the night of the wedding, confirming every step in the chain of custody for the pill organizer, from the moment Camille ordered it sealed on the ballroom floor to the moment it was transferred into the hospital laboratory. And Renata said that without that document, the entire body of physical evidence could have been thrown out in 30 seconds. But the final link was the hardest one of all. Renata's team spent nearly 4 weeks pulling the dispensing log data from the night of November 4th out of one of the hospital's backup servers. And when they finally opened it, everyone fell silent. The recovered file was only partial. Data fields had shifted out of place. Medication codes and operator codes had been mixed together, and the timestamps appeared in an old format the current system could no longer read. Renata said she had shown it to 2 information technology specialists, and both had told her that no conclusion could be drawn from the mess. Camille pulled the screen toward herself. She sat there for nearly 2 hours without saying a word, comparing line after line, and then she began pointing things out. She explained that this displaced field was actually the operator identification code, that the number which looked like a dosage was really a storage location code, that she had worked with that old timestamp format every night for 4 years and could read it faster than she could read a clock. And when she put everything back together, one fact became unmistakably clear. The substance that had killed Salvatore Belandi had never passed through her hands, had never been dispensed from the pharmacy inventory that night, and the original prescription in the system had been altered at 4:17 in the morning, more than 2 hours after he had already died. Renata Kowalski looked at her for a long time, then said that now she understood why no one had been able to make sense of this data for 3 years, and that the only person in the world who could stand before the board and explain it was the very person they had driven away. The news that Camille Prescott would testify as an expert witness before the board spread faster than Renata Kowalski had hoped, and 4 days before the review hearing, when Camille stepped out of the diner one afternoon, there was a car parked across the street, and an older man opened the door and got out. He was about 61 years old, his silver hair neatly combed, his walk unhurried in the way of a man who had never once been forced to rush in his life, and he smiled at her as though they were old acquaintances. He introduced himself as Ambrose Del Vecchio, and said he was asking for only 10 minutes over a cup of coffee, nothing more. Camille already knew the name. She sat across from him at a small cafe nearby, both hands resting in her lap, and waited. Ambrose didn't get to the point immediately. He talked about the weather, said he had worked for the Belandi family for 40 years, said he had held Raphael in his arms before the boy could even walk. Then he said he deeply admired what she had done on the night of the wedding, that the entire family owed her a debt, and his voice sounded completely sincere when he said it. After that, he reached inside his coat, took out an envelope, placed it on the table, and gently pushed it toward her. Camille didn't touch it. He said he had looked into her circumstances a little, that he knew there was still a debt hanging over her from the civil case 3 years earlier, the debt that caused every official paycheck she earned to be garnished before it ever reached her hands. A debt that, at her present income, she would still be paying when her hair turned gray. He said the amount represented by that envelope was enough to erase the entire debt, this very week, legally, with every document in order, and no one would ever know. Camille asked what he wanted. Ambrose stirred his coffee and said he didn't want very much. He said he understood that the data was extremely complicated, that it had been corrupted, that even the 2 specialists they hired had said no reliable conclusion could be drawn from it. He said that when she sat before the board, and they asked whether she was certain about the way she had interpreted those lines of data, all she had to say was that she wasn't sure. 2 words. Not a lie, he emphasized. Only an acknowledgement of the truth that the data was damaged, and no one could be 100% certain. Then she could stand up, go home, and her life would become much easier. Camille sat motionless, and in that moment, the cruelest thing happened. Something Ambrose Del Vecchio had no knowledge of, and had never accounted for. He didn't know she had a child. He didn't mention Micah, didn't ask about Micah, didn't even know the boy existed. Camille was the one who thought of him. In only a few seconds of sitting there and staring at the white envelope on the table, she had already imagined the debt being gone, imagined being able to take an official job again, imagined no longer surviving on day labor, imagined the audiology office, where she still had to think carefully before every appointment, imagined an apartment with an elevator, imagined sitting down to dinner with her son at night instead of washing dishes until 11 o'clock. She thought about all of it in a matter of seconds, and she understood that the person tempting her wasn't the man sitting across from her. It was herself. Camille lifted one hand and pushed the envelope back toward him. Then she spoke, and this time her voice carried loudly enough that several people at the neighboring tables turned to look. The only time in 3 years she had raised her voice at a stranger. 3 years ago, they tried to make me say those same 2 words, she said. They asked whether I was certain I had dispensed the correct medication. I said I was sure. They asked me again. I said I was absolutely certain, and I asked them to let me review the system logs. And they wrote in the record that the witness couldn't determine the matter with the necessary degree of reliability. They took those 2 words out of my mouth by making me into someone no one could trust. And 9 minutes later, my life was over. She stood. Now you're sitting here offering to pay me to say those 2 words myself. Voluntarily. About the one thing I do better than anything else in this world. Do you know what that means? It means you're trying to buy the last part of me they haven't already taken. Ambrose remained seated, one hand resting on his coffee cup, his expression unchanged. I lost my license. I lost my husband. I lost 3 years of my life, Camille said, and her voice lowered again, solid as stone. The one thing they never managed to take from me was knowing that I was right. You don't have enough money to buy that. Then she picked up her coat, walked out of the cafe without looking back, and left the white envelope lying untouched on the table. Camille told Renata Kowalski about the meeting that very afternoon, and Renata called Raphael Belandi before Camille had even reached the door. 2 days later, inside the mansion's large conference room, 11 men sat around the long wooden table, and Ambrose Del Vecchio was the first to speak. He didn't lower his voice, and he didn't avoid anything, because he had decided that this was the moment to fight in the open. He said that for the past 2 months, this entire family had become a joke across the city, that their boss was hiring lawyers, chasing courts, pouring money and time into clearing the name of a dishwasher he hadn't even known existed 6 months earlier. He said the only reason this city stood still was because people were afraid of the Belandi family, and that once they stopped being afraid, everything would collapse within a single winter. He said Raphael's father would never have done something like this. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked around the table, waiting for the others to nod with him. The room remained completely silent. Raphael didn't become angry. He rose very slowly, rested both hands lightly on the table, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet that the men sitting at the far end had to lean forward to hear him, and it was precisely that quietness that made the entire room turn cold. You mentioned my father, he said. Then let's talk about my father. He placed a document on the table, the unsigned draft transfer agreement dated near the end of October 3 years earlier. He intended to sign this. He spoke about it with only 2 people, his wife and you. 4 days later, he died at St. Aubin, and the first person to bring a name into this house for me to pour my anger onto was you. Then he placed a second document beside it, his mother's toxicology report. Earlier this year, my mother decided to finish signing that same agreement. She spoke about it at the dinner table, in front of you. And for months afterward, someone changed the medication in her pill box, a little every day, so little that no one noticed, until the night she stepped onto the dance floor with her daughter. No one in the room moved. You had dinner with my mother every Sunday, Raphael said. You called her your sister. Then you went home and calculated how much longer it would be before she couldn't get back up. Ambrose opened his mouth, but Raphael continued, still in the same quiet voice. If this had been last year, I would have handled it the way my father would have, and it would have been over in one night. But a few months ago, I watched a woman who had nothing, no money, no weapon, no status, kneel on this floor and hold on to my mother's life without asking for a single cent. Then I gave her the chance to destroy the man who had destroyed her, and she refused. That is strength. What you call strength is only fear, and fear is hollow, and I'm tired of it. He looked around the table, one man at a time. Starting today, everything changes. We're going to bring whatever can be brought into the light. Anyone who doesn't agree can stand up and walk out that door right now, and I won't stop you. Then he turned back to Ambrose and said the final words. As for you, from this moment on, you're no longer part of this family. Ambrose gave a dry laugh and said Raphael had no evidence, that he could throw him out the door but couldn't put him in court, and that Raphael wasn't foolish enough to drag Belandi family business in front of federal authorities. At that exact moment, the conference room door opened. Antonia Belandi stepped inside slowly, leaning on a cane, and placed a stack of papers on the table. She said she had been standing outside from the beginning, that she had heard everything, and that Ambrose was right about one thing. Her son couldn't be the one to file the complaint. Then she said that was exactly why she had filed it herself. I am the victim, Mr. Del Vecchio, Antonia said. Not this family, not my son, me. There is a toxicology report with my name on it. There is a sealed evidence record for my medication box. There is a paramedic's signature taken at the scene. I filed the complaint this morning. You can't stop me, because I have nothing left that you can take away. Ambrose Del Vecchio sat motionless for a long time. Then he stood, picked up his coat, and walked out of the room, and not one of the 11 men sitting around the table rose to follow him. Word that the Belandi family had cut him off spread through the city in less than a week, and that was what finally brought down the last wall. Because when Roland Whitmore realized that the man who had protected him for 3 years no longer had anyone standing behind him, he did exactly what men like him always do. He called his lawyer, requested a meeting with prosecutors, and told them everything in exchange for a plea agreement. He confessed to what had happened 3 years earlier. He also confessed to the prescriptions he had written for Antonia Belandi over the previous several months, and named the person who had instructed him to do it. The wall built from money and connections gathered over 30 years collapsed in 9 days. Roland Whitmore lost his medical license and was criminally charged. And one morning near the end of that month, workers arrived at St. Aubin Hospital and removed the brass plaque bearing his name from the wall in the main lobby. 9 months after the night a woman collapsed in the middle of a dance floor, Camille Prescott walked through the glass doors of St. Aubin Hospital and made her way down the corridor she had believed for the rest of her life she would never be allowed to enter again. She walked slowly. Every step stirred something in her chest that she couldn't quite name. Something both painful and sweet, because everything here was exactly as she remembered it. The smell of antiseptic, the sound of cartwheels rolling across the tile floor, the overhead speaker calling the name of some doctor on an upper floor. Only Camille had changed. At the end of the corridor, a 60-year-old woman was waiting for her. Odette Fairbanks, the former head of the pharmacy department, the only person on that terrible night who had said that something about the case wasn't right, the woman who had been pushed out of the investigation after only 4 days. When their eyes met, Odette didn't say a word. She simply stepped forward and wrapped Camille in a tight embrace. And inside that embrace, 3 years of humiliation, 3 years of keeping her head lowered, 3 years of becoming invisible. Everything Camille had locked inside her chest finally broke open into tears she had held back for far too long. Odette whispered that she had known from the beginning, that she had tried to call Camille, but Camille had disappeared, and that there hadn't been a single day when she hadn't blamed herself for not being strong enough to protect her back then. Camille wiped away her tears and said Odette had nothing to blame herself for, that simply knowing there had been one person in the world who believed her had been enough to carry her through the darkest years of her life. Then they returned her professional license to her, a small piece of paper that would have meant almost nothing to anyone else. But to Camille, it was an entire life, her honor, her dream, the person she truly was, and the person fate had tried to take away. When her fingers touched it, she stood silently in the middle of the corridor and let the tears fall. No longer tears of pain, but the tears of someone who had finally been allowed to come home. Then, on a spring morning in back of the yards, one of the poorest neighborhoods in Chicago, a place where people were still accustomed to breaking pills in half so they could make one prescription last twice as long, a free community pharmacy opened its doors to its first patients. On the simple sign hanging above the entrance were 2 words: Casa Antonia. Standing behind the consultation counter in the white lab coat she had once believed she would never wear again was Camille Prescott. She bent over a bundle of blister packs an elderly man had brought in inside a plastic bag, checking each medication one by one, showing him which 2 shouldn't be taken together, and she did it with the patience of someone who understood better than anyone the price of a small mistake, because she had once watched her own husband quietly stop taking his heart medication so the money could be saved for their son, and she would spend the rest of her life making sure that didn't happen to someone else. Antonia Belandi moved through the waiting room, pouring coffee for the people seated there, healthy and busy. Noemi was there on opening day as well, standing at the reception table and writing down each person's name in the register. Micah ran around the waiting room with a drawing in his hand, showing it proudly to everyone, and when Camille called his name from behind the counter, the boy immediately turned his head. He turned because he heard her. Camille froze for 1 second, still holding a medication box in her hand. Then she smiled and didn't let anyone see that her eyes were turning red. Across the street, beneath the shade of a tree, Raphael Belandi stood quietly watching through the windows. He didn't cross the street. He didn't go inside, because he understood that the place didn't belong to him and shouldn't carry his name. He simply stood there looking at the result he had helped build, while step by step he continued tearing away the darkness from his own life and guiding his family toward the light. A long road, and by no means an easy one, but a road he had decided to walk all the way to the end. When Camille's eyes found him through the flow of people passing between them, she didn't wave, and she didn't need to say anything. She only gave him a small nod, a gesture so slight and yet carrying an entire world inside it. Not the gratitude of someone weak toward someone powerful, but the acknowledgement between 2 human beings who had once stood in completely different worlds and had finally learned to truly see one another. Raphael nodded back, and at that very moment, Micah ran to the edge of the sidewalk, raised both hands, and made a sign. Raphael didn't know that language, but he understood those hands. The boy was saying thank you. This story carries a simple message for every one of us, that the true worth of a human being is never measured by the wealth they possess or the fear they spread, but by the way they treat the people the world has chosen to forget. In this life, any one of us can become invisible in the eyes of others, but no human being is without value, kindness, and dignity, no matter how deeply life tries to bury them, always retain the power to heal and to save. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to truly see us, willing to treat us like a human being, to change the course of an entire life. Always look at the people around you with respect, because you can never know how extraordinary a story, or how precious a soul, may be hidden behind an ordinary appearance. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day you can hear more meaningful stories like this one. How did you feel about Camille and Raphael's story? And which part moved you the most? Please leave a comment below and share what you truly felt in your heart, because we always want to hear your voice. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story all the way to the end. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next videos.